So the report being launched today outlines how over 100 million lives could be saved by 2060 through tobacco harm reduction and innovation. By replacing cigarettes with safer nicotine products such as vaping, heated tobacco, and oral nicotine, smoking related deaths could halve within a generation. The message is clear. Innovation, not ideology, will drive a smoke free future. So, the person here today who is the lead author of the report, Dr. Derek Yach, will discuss the report with us. So, welcome, Derek. Would you like to introduce the report and its methodology for us, please?
Yes. First of all, the rationale for the report is based on the fact that we continue to have 8.5 million people who die annually because of tobacco use. And in the latest WHO reports, we see that there are almost 1.3 billion people using tobacco products worldwide. The progress has been steady but slow. Most low middle income countries have yet to make major pushes. And while the overall global aggregates are slowly coming down, we have parts of the world where smoking rates, for example, among men exceed 50%, China, Indonesia being two countries. We have many other parts of the world where the heavier, older smoker has been almost neglected, both by harm reduction and, I might say, by traditional nicotine replacement therapy. And so we asked the question at this very important time as we head into COP11 next month in Geneva, what is it that we could do to accelerate the decline in deaths, disease, and disability? And in doing that, we built on a number of reports of 23 countries we've completed, where we modeled what would happen if we were to provide better access to tobacco harm reduction products steadily over the next few decades and simultaneously improve the quality of general cessation and the treatment of lung cancer. Those three we thought would be major drivers of bringing the death rate down, remembering that the deaths in smokers in the 2060s will occur in today's adult smokers. They will not occur in children, they will occur in today's adult smokers. And the methodology we used was to gather a global through a Delphi process to get consensus on what are reasonable estimates of improving access. What would we say are reasonable estimates of the benefits in terms of long-term health? And we tended to go for more conservative estimates. And then we summed the number of deaths over the next few decades to try and give you an estimate of what additional lives will be saved beyond what is generally happening. And the results we can talk about in a second.
Great. Thank you, Derek, for the introduction. So I have some targeted questions for you. And the first one is on the core findings of the report. So your report projects that over 100 million lives could be saved by 2060. So what, in your view, are the most decisive policy or behavioural shifts that need to happen now to make that projection a reality?
Well, let me just give you a little bit of flavor to that 100 million. First of all, it's so easy to let 100 million lives over the next 30 years roll off our tongue. That comes close to being able to provide that amount of benefit at a massive population level. And to put it into actual terms, the report gives country-specific data, where over the next 30 years, we would then be talking about 13 million lives being saved in China, 8 million in India, almost 5 million in Indonesia, 2 million in Japan, and still about 1.5 million in USA, just mentioning some of the bigger countries. These are huge, huge numbers. To your question, there obviously are many policy things at the very general level. What we need to do is to have the definition of tobacco harm reduction already in the Framework Convention implemented. And that means regulating proportionate to risk. It means having higher taxes on cigarettes and combustible products that kill you, and having minimal amount of taxes on vapes, nicotine pouches, heated tobacco products, and eventually e-shisha. I would add one small caveat. There are many who say that maybe we should have no taxes on those products. My own view is that we have to tax these products for two reasons. First, the mere fact of taxation legitimates them in the market. That then gives government the capability to enforce and end illicit trade. It also creates a legal framework for the discussion between the industry and government, particularly the finance departments, about what is the appropriate level to exit smoking-related products. And then, of course, what it also does is it gives a differential signal to the smoker or the tobacco, the user of toxic products, which should make it easier for them to decide on the product that's got the lower level of tax.
Yeah, very good point. And which regions or countries do you see as most likely to lead this transformation?
Well, I think first we should say which countries are leading this transformation. And I think this report comes at a time when I really believe, in the words of a recent Jefferies analyst at our New Approaches meeting, when he said that he truly believes the tide has turned in favor of tobacco harm reduction across the entire sector. And then if the investment community is now getting behind it, we've got to recognize that the consumers are way out front. 140 million people are already using these products. And what have we seen? Well, we've seen that snus and nicotine pouches have played a massive role in reducing the smoking rates across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland. We've seen that vapes have played a very big role over the last few years, particularly in the US, the UK, New Zealand. And heated tobacco products have cut adult consumption, particularly among men, by 50% in places like Japan, South Korea, Greece, Lithuania. We often don't think of those countries as places where we see progress, but they are happening. And then even in the low middle income countries, we're starting to see the glimmers of hope, where we're seeing that nicotine pouches seem to be driving down toxic forms of oral tobacco in Pakistan, a very significant development if this actually unfolds. If you ask the question, where else are we seeing regional support? Well, I think the Middle East has been fascinating. Not only are we seeing local innovation, local companies, particularly in the nicotine pouch and vape area, starting to grow, supported by governments in Saudi Arabia, for example, or by local private sector in the UAE. We've seen reversal of bans that were previously in effect in Egypt, Lebanon. Jordan is still hopefully to follow. Um, and even in Indonesia, we're starting to see serious glimmers of hope. If you put this together, it basically means that not only has the tide turned from the perspective of the investor, but the tide has turned from the perspective of many of the leading governments, some of the largest in the world, including China, Indonesia, and other places, where clearly they have not opted to ban or prohibit products. They've opted to regulate a normalized market, which is what I think makes complete sense. And that does mean that it's inevitable that we're going to see the expansion of tobacco harm reduction, despite the rhetoric that we still have coming out of WHO and the European Commission.
Yes, and you've mentioned there's been a mindset shift in some of these countries in terms of embracing innovation, not ideology, etc. Could you speak specifically about the role of scientific and medical leaders and what they can do to change the mindset in areas where we still need to see that change?
Yes, we know that in any area of innovation, it is the scientists and the research community, those involved in technology, that drives process. That's why we're starting to see the hope coming out of the oil and gas sector, the automobile industry, many of the transformative issues that we're seeing across agriculture and so on. And so it is the same in this sector. One of the big differences, though, is that the vast majority of the investment in R&D, billions of dollars, have been led by tobacco multinationals who a decade ago, or maybe even further back than that, were betting that in time, that would become a more profitable way of making business and a much healthier and sustainable way of doing it. A decade on, many have been proved absolutely right. The analysts have reported this. The share price reflects it. There's no question that the investment in R&D over the last 15 years is now being seen in terms of new forms of heated products, vapes, nicotine pouches, and I'm kind of thrilled to see the e-shisha development, which will potentially reach 100 million users of old charcoal-based shisha across the Middle East. The problem, though, is that the public sector has not been able to invest in the research and development needed, particularly to end the risks and the harms. Most of the research is still funded by the NIH, despite the huge cutbacks, and most of it tends to focus on trying to prevent youth access or looking for some negative aspect of harm reduction or nicotine, despite the fact that we've had nicotine on the market in nicotine replacement therapy for almost 30, 40 years without any particular concern. I do think, though, that while the importance of research needs to be stressed, it's not just general research. We now need to see whether the industry can come together, ideally in some way with the public sector, to put the same amount of support into low middle income countries, researchers and sciences and science capacity, if they've done so well in many of the advanced industrialized countries. That's to remind us that the vast majority of the deaths of the future and the lives to be saved will be in places like Indonesia, Nigeria, and South Africa, many of the Middle Eastern countries, and not so many in many of the advanced industrialized countries because the progress has been there.
Thank you, Derek. I have a question about lung cancer, as you've mentioned that in the report. And the report does place particular emphasis on lung cancer, especially the role of early diagnosis and screening alongside harm reduction. Why did you feel it was important to highlight lung cancer specifically, and how does addressing it fit into the broader strategy of saving 100 million lives by 2060?
Thanks for that, Jess. So remember the word is save lives. And remember that the framework convention objective is to reduce the death and disease associated with tobacco products. It's not simply to actually have people no longer smoking. So to go that extra mile, we've got to ask the question, what are the major diseases that actually drive the deaths from tobacco? And there are many. Of course, we know about COPD and cardiovascular and even tuberculosis. But lung cancer plays a particular role, and it accounts for almost a quarter of all the 8 million deaths that are caused by tobacco. When I started the work on the Framework Convention, and we're talking about 1998, we assumed at the time that the death rates then, which were horrific, 5 years survival of under 10%, would probably remain like that for many years. Well, we're wrong. We are starting to see the innovation of the pharmaceutical industry turning stage 4 lung cancer into survivable beyond 10 years. We're starting to see that instead of predicting a survival rate of under 10%, over the next 20 years, maybe less, we'll be able to get to levels where we're now at with breast cancer, which are in excess of 90% survival at 5 years. So that has an enormous transformative effect on meeting that objective of saving lives, because if you're going to save the lives, many of the people who are going to get lung cancer over the next few years, even if they switch, will have got it from their past smoking habit over the last 20 years. So giving an emphasis to the exciting, critical innovation going on in the lung cancer world does a few things. First, it signals that the innovation we're seeing is predominantly in developed countries. There are some extraordinary examples in African countries, particularly in Zambia and Kenya, where pharmaceutical companies are looking at how they can accelerate the new types of immunotherapy and related drugs for lung cancer and other diseases related to tobacco faster than they did in the West. I remain very bullish and very optimistic that what we saw for AIDS, which was a death sentence until we got antiretroviral therapy for developing countries, will soon start happening in the area of lung and other forms of cancer, meaning that these terrible cancers will be able to be managed as chronic diseases. Combine that with tobacco harm reduction and better cessation, and we may very well be off by orders of magnitude in terms of underestimating the 100 million. Hope we are.
Fantastic. Shall we end it there then, Derek?
Maybe just one last,
Okay.
two last comments, if I
Yeah,
may.
absolutely.
I think one question is how do we overcome the inertia and the enormous misinformation that we face from the public sector and WHO? And I think there are 2 points. I would hope that going into COP11, we will not have a whole lot of hand-wringing by the NGOs and the consumers and wasting of their time. Rather, they should recognize that this Director General's term is up in 15 months. This is not the time to even think that new initiatives will come out of WHO, but it is the time for the countries who saw the benefits to start thinking about a process when the new Director General is elected, to have some form of commission to clear the air and to start making progress to address what has not been addressed till now. Secondly, the industry, I think, needs to start doubling down on investing in medically licensed products, particularly in the vape and nicotine pouch space. And I would hope they'd start by doing the kind of randomized controlled trials that we now have showing that these products have a better benefit for cessation than nicotine replacement therapy. Without those, we will not get the incredible need to have the credibility of the physicians behind us. And then finally, we cannot ever forget that refrain that led to the incredible progress on AIDS. Nothing for us without us. We have fantastic consumer groups out there. We have a large number of patient support groups and people feeling the consequences of tobacco. What we don't yet have is a galvanized movement like we had for HIV/AIDS, where the nothing for us without us is applied directly, sharply, every time these issues are described, putting in front of people the faces of the smokers who've struggled and succeeded to get off their product, and making it very clear to the policymakers that this is important for the lives of millions of people, but it's also important for the political lives of the people making the decisions.